Hello, I'm Tom Doужer, and this video is misophonia. What is it? So misophonia is an extreme emotional reaction to typically occurring sounds. So miso means hate, phonia, sounds, misophonia, hate the sound. But it's not hating sounds in general, it's hating only specific sounds. We call these trigger sounds. And it's also been known, this condition is also known as selective sound sensitivity syndrome, or 4S. And this is really a better name for the condition because there are specific sounds, selective sounds, that the person is extremely sensitive to. However, misophonia is really the more popular name for this condition now. So what is misophonia not? Well, it's not a sensitivity to the volume of the sounds, to how loud the sound is. That's hyperacusis, and that's common, especially in small children. It's not a fear of a sound. That's phonophobia, and that's also common in children. Both hyperacusis and phonophobia are common with autism, for example, and in young children, being scared by the toilet or the vacuum cleaner sound. Right? But this is not misophonia. Misophonia is not being irritated or upset by a continuous, loud, intrusive, or an irritating sound. There are people who, when they're in this situation where there's this repeating sound, it just becomes so upsetting to them. These people are generally considered a highly sensitive person. Their level of tolerance for these obnoxious or irritating situations is not as high as with some other people. And so they get upset. For example, a person that would be just a highly sensitive person and not have misophonia is that if they hear a car drive by, it doesn't bother them. But if they hear a car drive by knowing that they're going to be hearing that car all day long and it's going to be intrusive into their life all day, then they start becoming very, very, very upset by it. So that's not misophonia, that's a highly sensitive person. Now, a person that's highly sensitive can also have misophonia. So, and there may be certain sounds that they are just sensitive to, but others that are misophonic sounds. And misophonia is not reacting to something like nails on the chalkboard, right? Or a baby crying, or a knife on a bottle, or a disc grinder, or a female scream. We call that normal. These are sounds that are part of the top 10 most irritating sounds. And that's normal to have sounds like that you don't like, that bother you. Now, with misophonia, there is an immediate reaction to the trigger stimulus. And it can be generally sounds or sights, and it's this immediate involuntary response. It's jerked out of the person, essentially. The triggers are generally soft sounds. If you don't have misophonia, or if it's not a trigger sound, you may not even hear the sound. But for a person with misophonia, if they're in a room and someone across the room starts popping their gum, they're gonna hear it, feel it, and it's a misophonia trigger. So, and there's these strong emotions with misophonia. Almost universally, you find emotions of hate, anger, rage, and disgust, resentment, being offended. These people want to get away from the sound or make it stop. And in many cases, the person's thinking of a verbal or a physical assault on the other person. And these can be very extreme, unwanted, ugly thoughts of harming the other person that's making the sound, but rarely do people with misophonia act out on these impulses. Misophonia triggers generally start with a familiar person and a sound. It's something in the person's life. And if you look at the common sounds that we experience as individuals, eating sound, dinner table sounds are very common in our life. And eating sounds or mouth noises are the most common triggers for misophonia. Kind of the second most common is breathing or nose sounds, nose whistles, heavy breathing, sighing, snoring, anything associated with breathing are often trigger sounds. But really, it can be any repeating sound. And the list of known triggers is like the list of all repeating sounds in the world. So it's not that these triggers come because a person is familiar, is in that situation and develops this misophonic trigger response. And then you find that triggers, if it starts with one person or one sound, then it spreads to multiple people, similar sounds, other places, sites associated with those sounds. So with time, these triggers spread and spread. Now, visual triggers, it generally, I guess we could have misophonia start with a visual trigger, but that seems to be rare. But the visual triggers, any visual image that occurs immediately before the trigger can become a trigger. For example, if I'm triggering to chewing, then bringing the food on my fork to my mouth could be a trigger. If I trigger to chewing, putting food into my mouth could be a trigger. Images that occur with the trigger can also become trigger stimulus. For example, jaw movement associated with chewing is very, very common as a trigger. And especially if someone triggers to gum popping, then the gum chewing visual is almost always a trigger for those people. And it can even be images that occur repeatedly after being triggered, although this is less common. Also, we find that repetitive movements such as leg jiggling or hair twirling, these are common trigger stimulus or stimuli, but I don't really know why. Well, I need to do more research. So if a person has misophonia, what's the prognosis? Well, for one thing, it doesn't just go away with time or getting older. In fact, generally, it gets progressively worse. It can be stable for years, and then it can escalate, and then be stable at that level, and then escalate again. It does seem to lessen, let's say the upheaval associated with misophonia tends to lessen as the teen matures into adulthood, because first off, they learn that they're going to be triggered and they can't have it. There's no other choice. They're just going to have to deal with this unpleasant reaction. And many people learn to suffer in silence. You know, if I scream and yell at my mom and it doesn't get any better, and I scream and yell at my friends and I ostracize my friends and it makes my life worse, then I learn to cope. I learned to suffer in silence. One lady said that when she was triggered, she would just go into another room and cry. And people also learn to modify their life to cope with misophonia. Many people with misophonia would never go to a movie theater because the popcorn crunching that is there, and it would be intolerable. They also modify their work conditions. I know of one case where a person dropped out of MIT who was doing very well. They were a junior, I believe, and became a machinist because the sound of the machines was not, blocked out trigger sounds, and they just couldn't take the trigger sounds in the classroom. And you find that misophonia is very detrimental to relationships. It really takes a caring, patient spouse to deal with a spouse who has misophonia to their sounds and their sights. It's really very detrimental. Now, this misophonia response, it's an involuntary reaction that's jerked out of the person. They're not choosing. If we look at the brain to kind of talk about what's going on here, what you find is that you have this cerebrum, which is our thinking brain up here. And with our thinking brain, we may say, okay, I'm going to stay calm. But with misophonia, the person can't stay calm. Now, there's this guy down here called the autonomic nervous system. It's in the brainstem, and I call that the lizard brain. And the lizard brain controls our reflexes, and I see this as the heart of misophonia. And then there's what we call the limbic system, which is what lights up when we have these strong emotions. And misophonia is this combination between the reflex reaction and the emotional reaction that's just yanked out of the person. People just can't stay calm when they're being triggered. So there's an initial response and then there's coping responses. So what happens to the person instantly when they hear the trigger, that's their initial misophonia response. And I've heard that compared to things like being slapped is either a physical or an emotional pow in the face, being poked in the ribs with a stick, being zapped with a cattle prod, or maybe being popped with a rubber band. We take this little rubber band here and it's like, ow, that hurt. And that's the way you should think of misophonia. It is an initial pow response. And it has these extreme emotions that come with it. And this initial response doesn't just happen and go away. It lingers, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, for a person to really calm down and get it back together again. Now, some of these things that misophonia responses is not, I'm saying this specifically to the parents, but also to the spouses and close friends, misophonia is not a way to control you as the parent or others. Right? It's not a way to get attention. It's not a choice. This is a reflex reaction. And it's not something that the person is going to just get used to. It's very aversive, and it's very difficult to deal with. I give you these two cautions. First, hearing triggers will make the misophonia response worse. So my initial trigger is like that, and I go, I don't like that. But if I keep listening to that sound, it's like, ow, right? That smarts. It gets stronger with hearing. The other thing is that hearing triggers makes new triggers. It causes them to spread. So we really don't want a person to tolerate being triggered. Now there's a coping response, and that's really what the person does in response to being triggered. They may cover their ears, they may run away, they may push or shove, and this is really also jerked out of the person in response to being assaulted, because misophonia is this kind of assault on the body and the mind, and this automatic, somewhat automatic response of fight or flight. It varies with person, and sometimes it's perplexing to the parents because they can have a friend over at the house and they crunch a chip and their child doesn't explode. But when there's no friends at the house and they crunch a chip, the child explodes. Now, it doesn't mean that the child wasn't triggered when their friend was there. What it meant, they were still zapped, but responding and acting out would be too costly. It could be too embarrassing to them. It could make them be ostracized from their friends. So please note that just because a person doesn't act out in that situation doesn't mean that they weren't triggered and they didn't feel it. I mean, we may be irritated in one setting and yell, but if we're stopped by a policeman, we typically are irritated, but we don't yell in that situation. So thank you for watching this video. Misophonia, what is it? If you can, we'd appreciate a donation to the Misophonia Treatment Institute. We'll use these funds for education to create more of these videos, for misophonia awareness of healthcare providers and professionals, as well as individuals, for research into misophonia to try to understand it completely, and also to develop treatments for misophonia, which is one of the focuses of the Misophonia Treatment Institute. Thank you very much.